Here's a fun fact nobody tells you about dying. It's incredibly rude about the timing. I died at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, 3 hours before a closing deadline, choking on a stale everything bagel while squinting at a red-lined lease agreement on my third monitor. My name was Owen Riley. I was 26 years old. I was a paralegal at a mid-size real estate law firm in Denver, and I had not seen actual daylight, the kind that doesn't come through a window with the blinds half shut against monitor glare, in 11 days. The last conscious thought I had was not about my mother, or my ex, or any of the things people are supposedly obligated to think about when the lights finally go out. It was, with total sincerity, if I don't finish redlining Section 4.3 tonight, Diane is going to have a stroke in the Tuesday status call. Then I stopped breathing, fell out of my ergonomic chair, and cracked my skull on the corner of a filing cabinet labeled Escrow, Misc, very on brand. I always did have a flair for dramatic exits nobody would ever witness. When I opened my eyes again, the first thing I noticed was that the ceiling was wrong. It wasn't the water-stained drop tile of my cubicle, the one with the brown ring shaped disturbingly like Florida that nobody in facilities had ever addressed. It was pale robin's egg blue with hand-painted crown molding, gold leaf catching the light in thin, deliberate lines, the kind of ceiling you only see in magazine spreads for 11-figure penthouses that regular people aren't allowed to actually sit in. Sunlight came in soft and warm through floor-to-ceiling windows, gauzy curtains breathing in and out with the breeze, and somewhere far below, gulls were screaming at each other over open water like they were settling a very old argument. I sat up. My body moved wrong, lighter, leaner, with a strange low simmer of heat sitting under my ribs like a second heartbeat that had nothing to do with the massive one currently hammering in my chest. My hands weren't mine. They were pale, uncalloused, elegant in a way my old hands, chewed cuticles, a permanent smudge of highlighter ink on the side of one finger, had never once been. The nails were manicured in a soft, expensive nude that probably cost more than a month of my old rent. A man in a crisp gray polo nearly dropped a tray of orange juice at the sight of me sitting up. Mr. Sinclair, catching the glass at the last second, liquid sloshing over his knuckles. I didn't realize you were awake. I can come back. It's fine, I said, and my voice came out lighter than I expected, faintly accented in a way that wasn't mine, softer vowels, a little southern polish, laid over something colder underneath. Who are you? His face did something complicated, somewhere between fear and confusion. It's Milo, sir. I've worked here for 8 months. Memories that weren't mine crashed over me like a rogue wave off South Beach, salt water up the nose, no time to brace. Owen Sinclair, Omega, 24. The most photographed, most despised husband in the state of Florida. He'd used a set of leaked internal documents, real ones, forged incriminations, it hardly mattered which, to blackmail Adrian Vance, the reclusive 33-year-old real estate mogul the tabloids loved calling the King of Brickell, into marrying him 3 weeks before Vance Realty Group's IPO. The wedding had made the front page of the Miami Herald, all white orchids and thunderous silence between the two men at the altar. So had the divorce rumors, 6 months later, which had never actually gone away, because neither party would file the paperwork to make them official. The original Owen had been, by every account currently sitting in my borrowed head, a nightmare, screaming at the household staff over cold coffee, throwing a baccarat vase at a wedding planner who'd suggested peonies instead of orchids, starving himself down into a gown 2 sizes too small because he'd wanted, more than anything, to be looked at by a man who refused to look at him. He'd vanished from his own life 2 nights ago, after a spectacular, door-slamming fight with Adrien that half the household staff apparently still hadn't finished gossiping about, and whatever had happened to him after that, wherever he'd gone, wherever he was now, I had absolutely no idea. I just knew I'd woken up wearing his skin, in his marriage, in the smoking wreckage of his mess. Milo, I said slowly, testing the name in my new voice like I was trying on a coat that belonged to someone else. What's today? Thursday, sir. Great. Milo, I would love some coffee. Black. And whatever's in that kitchen that isn't a juice cleanse. Milo's mouth opened and closed like a man watching his GPS reroute him off a cliff mid-turn. You usually only take grapefruit water and a single boiled egg white, sir. For your figure. Not today, I said, sinking back into what I could only describe as 1,200 thread count sheets. The fabric cool and impossibly soft against skin that wasn't mine yet, but was, apparently, going to have to be. Today I have died once already. I'm not doing it again over egg whites. He fled the room so fast he left the door swinging on its hinges. I lay there in a bed the size of my old studio apartment and did the math on my new situation, the same way I used to run numbers on a bad lease. I was married to a man the internet called terrifying and inhumanly cold, in a mansion overlooking Biscayne Bay, with zero rent, 0 billable hours, and apparently a bottomless account with my name stamped across the top of it. The kingdom hated me. My husband wanted me gone, and I had unlimited access to food, shelter, and the single greatest mattress of either of my lives. I laughed, a short, disbelieving bark of a sound that echoed strangely off the vaulted ceiling, and pulled the duvet over my head like a kid hiding from a thunderstorm. 10 minutes later, the door didn't just open. It got thrown open, hard enough to crack against the wall, and the entire room dropped 10 degrees in temperature that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Owen," said a voice like a landslide, gravel and weight, and absolutely no patience left in it. "Get up. We need to talk about the interview you gave to Page 6. I peeked out from under the duvet. He was, and I want to be extremely clear about this, unfairly attractive for a man about to commit a homicide. 6'4", black three-piece suit that fit him like a threat, dark hair pushed back from a sharp widow's peak, a jaw you could cut glass on, and eyes the exact stormy gray of the water outside the window right before a hurricane makes landfall. Adrien Vance looked like he'd been generated by an algorithm trained exclusively on the phrase ruthless business tycoon, and then somebody had gone back and added cheekbones for spite. The scent that rolled off him, sharp, electric, like ozone right before lightning strikes, undercut with something darker, cedar and old rain, hit something low and instinctive in my new body, some traitorous biological switch flipping to on before I could locate the off switch. I had approximately zero interest in examining that feeling right now, or possibly ever. "I didn't give an interview to Page 6, I said, which was true, because I had been dead until 40 minutes ago. They quoted you calling me a glorified concrete salesman with commitment issues." "Honestly," I said, sitting up and rubbing my eyes, "accurate, but not from me. I've been asleep." Adrian's jaw ticked, a muscle jumping under skin like a warning light. "You've been asleep since 11 a.m.? I contain multitudes." He stared at me the way you'd stare at a vending machine that just gave you Skittles when you paid for a Snickers, betrayed, confused, faintly suspicious that the machine was somehow mocking you personally. I could see him recalibrating in real time, trying to find the tantrum, the tears, the practiced wounded, look the real Owen apparently deployed on cue like a weather system. I gave him nothing but the honest, slightly delirious calm of a man who had recently escaped death via bagel and was frankly running on borrowed time and stolen sleep. "What game are you playing?" he said, low. "None. I'm too tired to play games. I would just like a coffee and possibly 8 more hours of unconsciousness. You can go back to hating me from a healthy distance, like usual. Win-win." Something flickered across his face. Confusion first, then something sharper, more interested, like a predator noticing the deer had stopped running and sat down, cross-legged, to file its own taxes instead. "You're different," he said finally, like it cost him something to admit it out loud. "I contain multitudes," I repeated, lying back down. "Close the door on your way out, it's freezing." He didn't move for a long moment. Then, very slowly, like a man conceding a chess match he didn't know he'd been playing, he shut the door, quietly, this time, instead of slamming it. I stared at the ceiling and thought, okay, that went weirdly well for a man who died 40 minutes ago. If you're already invested, welcome, stick around, because this is where it starts getting messy in the best possible way. Drop a like if you've ever wanted to fake your own personality transplant at work, and let's keep going. A week passed, maybe 10 days. Time gets slippery when you no longer have a commute, a boss, or a Slack notification badge, slowly and methodically radicalizing you against humanity itself. My routine became simple, almost embarrassingly so. I woke up when my body decided it was done, not when an alarm decided for me. Milo, who still handled me like unexploded ordnance, approaching sideways, setting trays down with both hands, retreating before I could make eye contact, brought food, and I ate all of it. Cuban sandwiches with the bread pressed so thin and crisp it practically shattered. Stone crab claws in season, cracked open and dipped in mustard sauce that made my eyes water in the best way. Thick slices of key lime pie that actually tasted like key limes, and not the neon green gas station imitation I'd grown up on. Actual carbohydrates, The whole glorious forbidden inventory the old Owen had apparently denied himself for years in the name of a magazine cover waistline and a wedding dress he wore exactly once. I found the house's library on the third day, 3 stories of glass overlooking the marina, more books than the entire Denver branch library I used to eat sad desk salads in during my one unpaid lunch break a week, and colonized a reading chair by the window like it had been waiting for me my whole 2 lives. I did not throw anything. I did not scream at staff. I did not, notably, chase Adrien Vance through the house demanding his attention, which, according to Milo's increasingly shell-shocked updates over breakfast trays, had been a load-bearing pillar of the old Owen's entire personality, right up there with the perfume and the tantrums and the very specific way he used to slam the good china. The household staff started looking at me the way you'd look at a house pet that had suddenly learned to do your taxes. Cautious, grateful, a little afraid it might stop. On the 9th day, I found a drawer in the study that wasn't actually locked, just stuck with age and humidity, and inside it was a stack of internal Vance Realty memos about a program called the Coastal Rebuild Initiative. $300 million in post-hurricane relief housing grants the company had publicly pledged to Homestead and Little Havana after last year's brutal storm season, the kind that had ripped roofs clean off and left blue tarp flapping over half a county for months. Something about the numbers itched at the old paralegal instincts, still lodged somewhere behind my new eyes, a phantom limb reaching for a red-line pen. I didn't say anything about it yet. I just memorized the account codes, cross-referenced 2 dates that didn't sit right next to each other, and put the folder back exactly where I found it, because if there's one thing 11 years of legal drudgery teaches you, it's that you never show your hand before you've read every single page. Then I went back to my chair and my book about zoning law reform, because apparently, in my new life, this passed for a beach read. The marina outside my window caught the afternoon light in long gold streaks, sailboat masts, clinking softly against each other in the breeze, and somewhere down below, I could smell someone grilling something, with lime and cilantro, that had absolutely nothing to do with my breakfast and made my mouth water anyway. I had died in a cubicle with the smell of burnt coffee permanently baked into the carpet. This salt air, citrus, the low murmur of a house that finally left me alone, felt, against every instinct I had, like winning. I was up on the rooftop terrace on a Tuesday afternoon, wrapped in a cashmere throw that had definitely never once, in its entire luxurious life, touched a Colorado winter, halfway through a genuinely fascinating chapter on Miami-Dade flood zone regulations, when the glass door groaned open behind me. Milo, I already told you, I don't need lunch for another hour. It's not Milo. The voice rolled over the terrace like weather moving in off the water. I didn't look up. Your Majesty, I said, mostly to needle him, since apparently the tabloids loved calling him a king, and I'd decided somewhere around day 3 that I loved annoying him more than I feared him. It's been 4 days since you've left this floor, Adrien said, stepping closer, hands in his pockets, sunglasses pushed up into dark hair the wind kept trying to rearrange. The board thinks you're either sedated or plotting something. Reading is not a crime in this state, last I checked. You're reading a coastal resilience zoning manual. It's a page-turner. I held up the book without looking away from it. Did you know the setback requirements in flood zone AE increased 18 inches after the last storm season? Riveting stuff. I couldn't put it down at breakfast. Silence. I finally glanced up. Adrien was staring at me with the particular blank horror of a man who had spent 6 months preparing for hysterics and had instead, without warning, been handed a pop quiz on municipal code he had no intention of studying for. What are you doing, Owen? Enjoying my Tuesday. You're blocking my son. You blackmailed me into a marriage 6 months ago using documents you almost certainly forged. You've screamed at my board of directors during a live earnings call because it interrupted your spa appointment. And now you're sitting up here reading flood ordinances like a retired urban planner, nursing a grudge against the county commission. People change, I said. Also, in my defense, I don't actually remember doing any of that, so I can't really mount a defense. But I promise you I have zero current intention of repeating it. Consider it a fresh fiscal quarter. He took another step closer, and the air around him thickened. That same crushed flint, pre-storm scent from the first day, heavier now, curling low into something that made my new biology sit up and take unwanted, extremely detailed notes. My cheeks went warm despite the ocean breeze cutting across the terrace. Your scent's is different too, he said, quieter, almost to himself, like he hadn't meant to say it out loud. It used to smell like. He stopped. Like what? Anxiety and too much Chanel no. 5, he admitted, and for one unguarded second, something almost like humor crossed his face before he visibly stamped it back out, filing it away somewhere behind that jaw. Now you just smell like. He cut himself off again, jaw tightening like he'd caught himself a half second from confessing to a felony. Sunscreen, I offered helpfully. I've been reapplying obsessively. Red-headed ancestry, very tragic, very burn-prone. You're not a redhead. Details. I waved a hand, dismissing the entire concept of hair color as beneath us both. Say what you actually came up here to say, Adrien. You didn't climb 4 flights of stairs in a 3-piece suit to critique my complexion. He exhaled, not quite a laugh, but adjacent to one, a low, rough sound that did something entirely unfair to the pit of my stomach. There's a gala tonight. The Foundation's annual fundraiser for the Coastal Rebuild Program. You're expected. Am I? You're my husband. It would raise questions if the most photographed marriage in South Florida real estate stopped showing up to things together. I marked my page with a crumpled receipt from the side table and closed the book. Fine. But I want to sit next to the shrimp cocktail, not next to whoever's currently trying to seduce you with a hostile takeover disguised as a fundraiser. Adrien went very still, the ocean wind the only thing moving between us. How do you know about Sebastian? I don't, I said honestly, biting back a grin. I made that up, but your face just told me everything, so thank you for that, genuinely. Very useful information. For the second time in a week, Adrien Vance looked at me like I'd rewritten the terms of a contract he thought he'd already lost, carefully, permanently, and possibly to his own benefit, though he clearly hadn't decided yet whether that was a compliment or a threat. The Vance Realty Coastal Preservation Gala was held in a glass-walled ballroom on the 62nd floor of the company's flagship tower on Brickell Avenue, with Biscayne Bay spread out below like a bed of hammered silver catching the last of the sunset. Every real estate power player in South Florida was there, dripping in the specific sun-bronzed opulence you only find at the intersection of new money and old palm trees. Rolexes catching the chandelier light, laughter pitched exactly 1 register too loud, the whole room humming with the particular electricity of people who all secretly wanted something from each other. I wore a simple charcoal suit with none of the sequins and dramatic cutouts the old Owen apparently favored, and when the doorman announced my name into the ballroom's low roar, the entire room went quiet in that specific ugly way that means everyone is waiting for you to combust on cue. They wanted the show. Owen Sinclair, unhinged and humiliating, right on schedule, dessert before dinner. I gave them nothing. I walked the room at a normal human pace, nodded politely at a developer I vaguely recognized from a Forbes 30 under 30 list, and made a beeline for the shrimp cocktail table like I'd promised myself on the elevator ride up. Adrien sat at the head table, dark suit, single glass of scotch untouched in front of him, radiating the specific exhausted authority of a man who would rather be reviewing zoning variances alone in a windowless room than making small talk with 300 people who all wanted a piece of his skyline. Beside him sat a devastatingly handsome man with sun-streaked hair and a smile that had clearly never once in its entire existence doubted itself. You must be Owen, the man said, extending a hand with rings on 3 fingers. Sebastian Klein. I do PR consulting for the Coastal Preservation Foundation. Congratulations on the rings, I said, shaking his hand. Very tasteful. Very I inherited a trust fund and a personality disorder. Sebastian blinked, recalibrating, then laughed like I'd made an excellent joke, instead of an insult he hadn't fully processed yet. We were so worried you wouldn't make it tonight, he said, turning the wattage up another notch. Adrien mentioned your delicate constitution. My what? Your stamina, Sebastian said, all syrup, sliding a proprietary hand a fraction closer to Adrien's wine glass. It must be exhausting keeping up with a man like Adrien. Some people just aren't built for the pace of real power. The table went quiet. Someone near the ice sculpture actually stopped breathing. I picked up a shrimp, dipped it, ate it. Genuinely excellent cocktail sauce, the kind with real horseradish bite. I swallowed, wiped my fingers on the linen napkin, and finally gave Sebastian my full attention. You're completely right, I said pleasantly. My stamina's terrible. I sleep 10 hours a night, minimum. You, though, you seem incredibly energetic. Really admirable work ethic, actually. I'm impressed. Sebastian preened, throwing Adrien a quick, triumphant glance. I take my commitment to this foundation very seriously. I can tell, I said. You've clearly got range. Tell me, have you ever done any real public speaking? I don't mean a toast at a gala. I mean the kind where reporters ask follow-up questions. Sebastian blinked, thrown by the sudden pivot in the conversation. Yes, actually. I emceed the foundation's spring luncheon last year. Very well received. Perfect. I turned to Adrien's chief of staff, who was hovering nearby with a tablet, and gave her my most helpful, most sincere-looking smile. Put Sebastian down as the keynote for Monday's Coastal Rebuild press conference. He clearly knows this program inside and out, the disbursement schedule, the unit counts in Homestead, all of it. Let him field the reporters' questions directly. Save the rest of us the trouble. The color drained out of Sebastian's face in real time, like watching a phone battery hit 1%. The press conference. That requires a detailed accounting of the entire grant timeline. I don't actually handle the financial side. I'm more of a big picture person, really. The narrative, the vision. You just said you take your commitment to this foundation very seriously, I said, reaching for another shrimp with the calm of a man who'd already won and was simply enjoying his appetizer. I'm just delegating to the most qualified, most energetic candidate in the room. You'll be wonderful. I have complete faith in you. The silence at the table stretched into something almost holy. I glanced sideways and found Adrien staring at me, the perpetual storm behind his eyes replaced with something sharp, curious, and unmistakably impressed, the corner of his mouth twitching in a way he was clearly fighting to suppress. I did not smile. I ate my shrimp cocktail like the consummate professional I'd trained to be for 11 brutal years, and let Sebastian sit there marinating in his own ambush, the ice sculpture slowly weeping onto the tablecloth beside him. Peace, I've found, is a delicate ecosystem. Introduce one invasive species, 6'4", tailored in Zegna, smelling faintly of an incoming storm, and the whole thing collapses beautifully, gorgeously, and entirely on schedule. 3 nights after the gala, I was curled in the library with a fresh stack of financial reports I'd very casually asked Milo to leave lying around, when the door slammed open with enough force to rattle the window glass in its frame. I didn't look up. I already knew the scent. A stack of binders hit the reading table beside me with a crack like a gunshot, scattering my careful notes into disarray. Explain this, Adrien said. I glanced at the top binder without much urgency. Coastal Rebuild Disbursement Records, Q2. You'll have to be more specific. There's about 11 things wrong in here, and I've only had a week with them. You told the board's compliance officer this morning that our grant accounting doesn't reconcile. It doesn't. You've been in this house for 2 weeks and change. I've had a lot of free time, I said, pulling the binder toward me and flipping to a page I'd already dog-eared. Also, some skills don't disappear just because you moved states, or bodies, or entire timelines. Look, your controller's booking the disbursed housing vouchers as fully deployed the moment funds leave the account. But your own subcontractor invoices show a 2 to 4 month lag between fund release and actual unit completion in Homestead. That gap? On paper, it looks like a rounding error, the kind of thing an auditor's eyes slide right over on the way to lunch. In practice, it's about $11 million sitting somewhere that isn't housing families whose roofs blew off 18 months ago. Adrien didn't move. His scent had shifted, the sharp ozone edge, softening into something heavier, wetter, like petrichor after real rain finally breaks a drought. Where did you learn to read a P&L like that? He asked, low, almost accusatory, like competence itself was another form of provocation. I told you multitudes. I clicked my pen. Give me a red pen and about 2 hours, and I'll show you exactly which line items are hiding it. He didn't move for a long moment, watching me with an expression I couldn't fully place. Not suspicion anymore, not quite. Something closer to a man realizing the door he'd spent months bracing against had been unlocked, and gently swinging open the entire time. Slowly, he pulled out the chair across from me and sat. 20 minutes of near silence passed, broken only by the scratch of my pen and the occasional low, disbelieving exhale from Adrien as I dismantled 6 months of sloppy, or possibly deliberate, bookkeeping, line by patient line. It felt, disturbingly, exactly like my old life. Except this time the stakes were an actual family's roof over their heads, not a senior partner's Tuesday mood. Finally, I set the pen down and pushed the binder back across the table. There. Your property manager on the Homestead project, Grant Foley. He's the common thread on every single delayed disbursement. I'd start there, Adrien repeated, one eyebrow lifting. Not go public with it tomorrow morning? God, no. I gave him a look that probably belonged in a courtroom. You march into a boardroom with an accusation like this half-cooked, and Foley shreds 2 file cabinets before lunch and disappears to a country without an extradition treaty. You build the case quietly, pull his signed authorizations, cross-check them against the actual completion dates, get 3 independent auditors to confirm before you say his name out loud in front of a camera. It's slower. It's also the only version of this where the actual money comes back to the actual families. Adrien studied the pages, then studied me, longer this time. The line of his jaw had gone soft in a way I hadn't seen since I'd woken up in this ridiculous gilded life. Why are you helping me? He asked. You could have let it burn. You hate me. I've made that easy enough, God knows. I don't actually hate you, I said, surprising myself with how true it came out, the words leaving my mouth before I'd fully vetted them. And honestly, I have a lot of free time and a genuine allergic reaction to bad math. Consider it a professional courtesy. I stretched, joints popping down my spine. Also, now that you owe me, I want compensation. His eyes narrowed instantly, old suspicion flaring back to life like a pilot light. There it is. What do you want, Owen? Jewelry. A car. You want me to fire Sebastian outright tonight? I want the thermostat in my wing fixed, I said. It's 81 degrees in there at all times, and I refuse to sleep in a sauna just because you find Miami humidity character building. Adrien blinked. Once. Twice. The thermostat. The AC unit on the east wing is original to the build. It's older than some of your junior associates. I want it replaced with something that can actually beat June in South Florida, or I will personally file a formal habitability complaint against you with myself, and I promise you I will win. For 1 full second, Adrien Vance, reclusive tycoon, terror of quarterly earnings calls, the man 3 separate business magazines had called unknowably cold, let out a laugh, short, rusty, like it hadn't been used in a long time and badly needed oiling. It transformed his whole face, cracked something open in the harsh lines around his eyes. Done, he said. Anything else, Your Majesty? Don't call me that. That's your title, not mine. I picked my book back up, hiding the fact that my ears had gone warm. Close the door on your way out. The old unit's still limping along tonight, and it's already trying to kill me. He lingered a moment longer than the exit strictly required, gaze heavy on the side of my face, before I finally heard his footsteps retreat down the hall, unhurried in a way they hadn't been an hour ago. I had a distinct, sinking suspicion that my quiet little post-death vacation was officially, catastrophically over. Biology, I was learning the hard way, does not care about your 5-year plan. It started as a dull ache behind my eyes on a Thursday, easy enough to blame on too much reading in bad light. By evening, it had become a full-body furnace, a restless, gnawing heat that had nothing to do with the finely fixed air conditioning, and everything to do with an omega body I still hadn't fully learned to live in. It wasn't a heat. I'd read enough by now to know exactly what an actual heat looked like on paper, and this wasn't the apocalypse-grade event the old Owen's medical file described in alarming clinical detail. This was something quieter, sharper, a pre-cycle hormonal spike, the kind that sneaks up when your body's spent weeks recalibrating without an alpha nearby to regulate it, and I'd been stubbornly, aggressively alone in my wing this entire time, more out of habit than principle. I didn't call Milo. The kid was jumpy enough around me, without babysitting a feverish, sweating mess at midnight. Instead, I dragged a throw blanket down to the wine cellar beneath the library, the coolest, quietest room in the house, walled in stone and dust, and the papery smell of the archive boxes stacked along one side, decades of receipts and old blueprints nobody had touched in years. I curled onto a leather bench in the corner, knees to my chest, and let my skull throb in time with my pulse. I drifted, dreamed of fluorescent office lights buzzing overhead, the low mechanical hum of a server room down the hall, an inbox that never ever emptied no matter how fast I typed. I dreamed of choking on a bagel at 2 a.m., and thinking absurdly, urgently, of Section 4.3, like some part of me was still down there in Denver, still trying to finish the job. Then the air changed, ozone, crushed flint. Rain before it falls, that specific electric smell that means the sky is about to open. A low, humiliating sound scraped out of my throat before I could stop it, my new biology lighting up like a struck match, every instinct in this borrowed body leaning toward the door. Owen. I cracked my eyes open. Adrien was on his knees in front of the bench, tie gone, sleeves shoved up his forearms, the panic on his face raw and completely unguarded for the first time since I'd met him. No boardroom mask, no careful distance, just a man who looked genuinely, visibly frightened. "Don't," I rasped. My voice sounded like gravel dragged over concrete. "I'm fine." Milo said you hadn't come out of your wing in 6 hours. You didn't answer the intercom. His hand hovered an inch from my cheek, like he was afraid contact would shatter something. "Why are you down here, in the cellar?" "Cool," I mumbled, shivering despite the sweat sticking my shirt to my spine. "Cellar's cool. Wanted cool." He swore softly under his breath, then closed the distance anyway, pressing the back of his hand to my forehead. His skin ran hot, dangerously hot. An alpha's baseline running several degrees over anyone else's, and it should have made things worse. Instead, it felt like relief pouring down my spine, and I hated, on principle, on every remaining shred of dignity I had left, how badly my body wanted to lean into it. I leaned into it anyway. Adrien went very still. Then, carefully, like he was handling something fragile and entirely unfamiliar, he slid one arm under my knees and the other behind my back and lifted me clean off the bench like I weighed nothing at all. "Put me down," I said, with zero conviction whatsoever, fisting a weak hand in his shirt instead of pushing him away. "I don't need a doctor. I need 8 more hours of unconsciousness and possibly an ice bath." "You need suppressants and an actual bed," he said, already climbing the stairs, unhurried and sure-footed even with me in his arms. "You've been running yourself into the ground fixing my company's books at 2 in the morning for a week straight. This is what happens to a body that doesn't rest." The exhaustion of 2 entire lifetimes finally caught up with me all at once, and my filter went with it, dissolving somewhere around the second flight of stairs. "I just want to clock out," I mumbled against his shoulder, the words slurring together. "Please, just let me clock out for like a decade, maybe 2. His steps slowed on the landing. "Clock out? What does that mean?" "I worked 11 years, I said, eyes falling shut. "And I never took a real vacation, and I died on a bagel at my desk at 2 in the morning, and now I'm here, married to a man everyone says is a monster, doing math for a real estate empire I didn't ask to inherit, and I'm just tired, Adrien. So tired." He didn't say anything for a long moment. I felt his heartbeat, steady and enormous, against my ear, a rhythm I hadn't realized I'd been listening for. "You didn't die," he said, finally quiet, like the words cost him something to say out loud. "I absolutely did. There's a filing cabinet in Denver with a dent in it to prove it." "You're here," he said, and something in his voice cracked wide open, low and fierce, all pretense gone. "And I don't know what happened to you before this, or what happened to whoever was in this body before you, but I am not letting either version of you disappear on my watch. Do you understand me?" "Not on my watch." I didn't have the strength left to answer with actual words, so I just nodded against his collarbone and let my eyes fall closed the rest of the way, trusting, for the first time since I'd woken up dead in a stranger's marriage, that someone else was carrying the weight for a while, and that I was allowed to set it down. He carried me the rest of the way to my room, laid me down on sheets that smelled like fresh cotton and the new AC units blessed cold air, and didn't leave. Not when the physician came, black bag and worried eyes. Not when I fought the bitter suppressant tincture on stubborn principle, gagging at the taste. Not once through the whole miserable, sweat-soaked night. Every time I surfaced, he was there, a steady wall of heat and quiet, murmuring something low every time I flinched, until the fever finally broke somewhere near dawn, the worst of it wrung out of me like water from a towel. The very last thing I remember before actually sleeping, the good kind, dreamless and deep, the kind I hadn't had in either lifetime, was cracking one eye open, finding him still sitting in the chair he'd dragged beside the bed at some point in the night, and rasping, "If you let that thermostat guy talk you into just a little warmer for balance, I will come back from the dead a second time out of pure spite, and it will be so much worse for you than the first time." Adrien huffed something that might, in a braver world, have been called a laugh, 68 degrees, in writing. "I'll have legal draft it first thing tomorrow, notarized if you want." "Good," I mumbled, and finally let myself go under. Autumn in Miami doesn't really exist, not the way it does anywhere with actual seasons, but something in the house shifted anyway, quiet and gradual, like a tide coming in without anyone announcing it. Adrien started finding excuses to be in the library at the hours I usually read. He'd bring 2 coffees without asking how I took mine. He'd apparently just started paying attention, filing it away somewhere between quarterly earnings and zoning appeals, and drop into the chair across from me with a laptop he rarely bothered to open. We fell into a rhythm, me buried in the coastal rebuild files, slowly building an actual paper trail against Grant Foley one signature at a time, him watching me work with an expression he clearly thought was subtle, and was, in fact, wildly not. "You're staring," I told him one evening, without looking up from a receipt I was cross-referencing. "I'm supervising. You're staring at my hands." "My hands are not doing anything interesting right now. They're holding a stapler. It's a nice stapler." I looked up at that, and he had the audacity to not even pretend to be embarrassed, just held my gaze with the ghost of a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, and something low in my chest did a slow, traitorous flip that I chose to blame entirely on the coffee. "You're bad at flirting," I informed him. "I've never had reason to practice," he said, unbothered. "The last person I married hated the sound of my voice enough to leave the room whenever I used it. Rude of them. It's a fine voice. Very load-bearing, like a good column. Structurally sound, holds up the whole conversation without anyone noticing the work it's doing." I went back to my folder before he could see my ears going pink under the library's warm light. "Don't let it go to your head, Vance." "Too late," he said, and this time when he smiled, it reached his eyes completely, storm gray gone warm as harbor water at noon, and I thought with a small internal sigh of doom, oh no, I actually like him. The Winwood Deturret was Adrien, of all people, who suggested we leave the house. "You've been inside for 11 days straight," he said one morning, dropping a coffee in front of me with more force than strictly necessary. I checked. Milo keeps a log, apparently, out of concern. Milo needs a hobby. Get dressed. Something that isn't a reading chair with legs. 40 minutes later, we were standing in front of a mural on NW 2nd Avenue in Winwood. Paint so bright it practically hummed in the midday sun, the whole neighborhood smelling like fresh Cuban coffee and hot asphalt and, faintly, spray paint from somewhere still being touched up down the block. Adrien had traded the three-piece suit for a plain gray t-shirt and sunglasses, and without the armor of tailoring he looked younger, less like a headline, and more like an actual person who occasionally forgot to eat lunch. "This is where you take all your business rivals to intimidate them?" I asked, tilting my head at a 2-story mural of a jaguar mid-leap, colors bleeding into each other like something out of a fever dream. "This is where I come when I don't want to be found," he said. "Nobody expects the king of Brickell to be standing in front of street art eating a croqueta. Buy me one and I'll keep your secret." He did, from a window counter that had clearly been slinging the same recipe since before either of us was born, the ham and cheese still warm enough to fog the little paper bag. We ate standing on the curb, shoulder to shoulder, and for a while neither of us said anything worth transcribing, just the two of us, watching a street artist 3 doors down fill in the eye of some enormous unfinished bird, traffic humming past, someone's radio drifting out an open shop door playing something with a lot of trumpet in it. "Tell me something true," I said eventually, licking a crumb off my thumb. "Something the tabloids don't have." Adrien was quiet for a second, watching the bird take shape. "I wanted to be an architect. Before my father died and I inherited the company at 26, I still keep a set of drafting pencils in my desk. I've never used them for anything but doodling in the margins of contracts I hate. That's disgustingly sincere for a man who once threatened to have my sister exiled from a fundraiser." "I never actually did that, I know. I checked the file. You just yelled about it once, extremely dramatically, and then apologized to her in writing within 24 hours. I bumped his shoulder with mine. "You're not nearly as terrifying as the internet thinks you are, Vance. Don't tell anyone. I have a brand to protect. Your secret's safe with me. I contain multitudes, including your entire company's financial history, and now, apparently, your tragic architectural ambitions." He laughed, that same rusty, underused sound easier now, less startled out of him and more just given freely, like he'd decided somewhere between the croqueta and the mural that I was worth the risk of being caught smiling in public. On the walk back to the car, his hand found mine without either of us commenting on it, warm and a little rough at the knuckles, and I let it stay there the entire way home, watching the Winwood walls slide by the window in a blur of color, and thought that if this was what the rest of my ridiculous second life was going to feel like, I could probably learn to live with it. Everything came to a head at the quarterly shareholder meeting in November, held in the glass atrium of Vance Tower with 300 investors, 4 news crews, and, for the first time, me, seated not in the decorative consort's chair against the wall, but at a desk adjacent to Adrien's podium, armed with a stack of red-flagged ledgers and absolutely no jewelry. I wore a plain charcoal suit. I looked like an auditor. I felt like one, and after 11 years it fit better than any Valentino gown ever could have. Adrien was midway through addressing a routine question about the coastal rebuild timeline when Sebastian Klein rose from the third row, flanked by 2 board members, Preston Wexler and Silas Doyle, and a nervous junior VP I hadn't bothered learning the name of yet. I recognized the arrangement immediately, the way you recognize a bad contract clause on site. 3 men who'd each quietly lost money the moment Foley's disbursement games had started drawing scrutiny, and 1 very well-dressed mouthpiece who'd offered to do their yelling for them in exchange for a permanent seat at Adrien's table. It wasn't loyalty holding that little cluster together. It was math, same as everything else in this building. Mr. Chairman, Sebastian announced, voice pitched to carry across the entire atrium. Before we continue, the Foundation has uncovered something the board deserves to hear. We have documentation that Owen Sinclair has been diverting coastal rebuild disbursements, public relief funds meant for storm victims, into private accounts connected to his own family's holding company. Gasps rippled through the room. Cameras swiveled on their tripods like a single organism turning toward blood. It was, I had to admit, a beautifully staged ambush. It was also a complete fabrication, and a lazy one at that. Adrien's knuckles went white on the podium, his scent flaring hot and sharp enough that the front 3 rows visibly leaned away from him. "You dare stand in my own boardroom and, Adrien," I said, not loudly, just clearly enough to cut clean through the noise. "Sit down. I've got this." He froze mid-sentence, looked back at me. I didn't look angry. I looked, I imagine, mildly inconvenienced. The exact face I used to make at opposing counsel who thought they'd found a loophole I hadn't already closed 3 drafts ago, back when my biggest weapon was a red pen and a caffeine addiction. I stood, picked up the top binder from my stack, and walked to the center of the atrium floor, heels clicking against marble, stopping a few feet from Sebastian and his entourage. "Diverted funds," I repeated. "That's the claim?" "We have the wire transfer logs," Sebastian said, chin lifted, though a bead of sweat was already forming at his hairline under the studio lights. "You have wire logs from July," I said, opening the binder to a tabbed page, which show funds moving through a Sinclair Holdings escrow account, because that account is the court-appointed third-party disbursement agent for the entire homestead phase, set up 8 months before I ever set foot in this marriage. It's not a diversion. It's a compliance requirement. You'd know that if you'd read past page 1. Or honestly, if you'd read it all, the print's not that small. A ripple of laughter moved through the front rows. Sebastian's smile didn't fully crack, but it wobbled visibly. That still doesn't explain the missing 11 million in unit completions. "No," I agreed. "It doesn't. So let's talk about that since you brought it up." I flipped to the next tab. Preston Wexler. "Your subcontractor bids for the homestead units came in 18% over every competing quote in the county, and your brother-in-law happens to own the concrete supplier you exclusively sourced from. That's not a coincidence. That's a family business plan with extra steps." Wexler's face went the color of old drywall. "Silas, your name is on 4 separate change orders for storm damage repairs to units that permitting records show were never actually built. I'd love to see photos of that damage, by the way, purely for my own curiosity." Doyle opened his mouth and produced no sound whatsoever, like a fish that had never learned it was supposed to breathe air on this particular side of the tank. And Grant Foley, who isn't even here to defend himself today, because he's currently very busy answering questions from 3 independent auditors I brought in 6 weeks ago, has been sitting on completed disbursements for months, booking them as deployed, while families in Homestead are still living under blue tarps 18 months after the storm. I closed the binder. The atrium had gone graveyard silent, 300 people holding their breath at once. "So no," I said, turning finally to Sebastian, "I haven't diverted a single dollar. I found where your 11 million actually went. You brought a rumor to a knife fight and didn't even check if the knife was real, or if it belonged to the guys standing on either side of you." I set the binder down on the nearest empty chair. "I don't steal money, I audit it. And the 3 of you are currently the single largest inefficiency on this company's balance sheet. Congratulations, I suppose." It's rare to see it laid out with quite this much confidence in front of live cameras. Nobody moved. Somewhere in the back, a reporter's pen scratched furiously against a notepad, chasing the story. Adrien's voice finally broke the silence. Low and absolutely lethal. Legal. Compliance. I want a forensic audit of every account these three men have touched, effective immediately, and I want Foley's cooperation agreement finalized by 5 p.m. Or I want the SEC to have his home address by 5:01. He looked at Sebastian, and his voice dropped another degree colder. The Foundation's contract with Vance Realty is terminated, effective this second. You have 15 minutes to clear your desk, and if you'd like a reference, I'd suggest a career in fiction, given your obvious talent for it. Security escorted the three men out, cameras trailing them the whole way. Sebastian, to his credit, at least kept his dignity until the elevator doors closed on his face. Adrien stepped down from the podium as the room dissolved into a roar of reporters shouting questions over each other, crossed the floor, and stopped in front of me, ignoring every camera still pointed at him. You just publicly humiliated 3 board members and saved my company $11 million in front of live news crews, he said. You're welcome. That was the single most terrifying thing I've ever watched, he said, voice rough. And I have watched hostile takeovers happen in real time, in this exact room. I contain multitudes, I said, and finally let myself smile. He didn't laugh this time. He just looked at me, at my cheap department store tie and my stack of red tab binders and the tired, victorious set of my shoulders, like I was something he had absolutely no intention of ever letting out of his sight again. Not for a boardroom, not for a headline, not for anything. The atrium finally emptied an hour later, reporters herded out by a very relieved PR team, leaving Adrien and me alone in the wreckage of scattered chairs and abandoned coffee cups, the afternoon light going gold and slanted through the glass walls. I sank into the nearest seat and rubbed the bridge of my nose. I hate this job, I muttered. Adrien came to stand behind me, resting both hands on my shoulders, and began working the knots out of my neck with a firmness that made my whole spine go loose with relief. You were terrifying, he murmured, bending low enough that his breath stirred the hair at my temple. I don't think I've ever seen anything more impressive in my life. Including the day we closed the tower deal. High praise from a man who owns a 62-story building. Owen, he said, quieter now, all the boardroom steel gone out of his voice entirely. Whoever you were before you woke up in this house, I don't fully understand it, and I'm not sure I need to. But I know the man who married me for leverage is gone, and I know I don't want this version of you to ever leave. I should have said that the day you asked me to close the door quietly. I turned in the chair to look up at him, and for once I didn't have a joke loaded and ready to fire. That's annoyingly sincere for a man nicknamed after a heartless monarch. I contain multitudes, he said deadpan, and I laughed so hard I nearly fell out of the chair, and he caught me, hand at my waist, easy and sure, like he'd been doing it for years instead of weeks. For the record, I said, once I'd recovered, I'm not doing another shareholder meeting like that again anytime soon. Tomorrow I'm sleeping until noon, reading something with dragons in it, and I am not looking at a single spreadsheet, not even for you. Whatever you want, Adrien said, and he meant it with the terrifying, absolute sincerity of a man who'd apparently decided somewhere between the fever and the boardroom that I'd become the most important line item in his entire empire. You could burn this whole company to the ground tomorrow and I'd hand you the matches myself. Careful, I'll hold you to that. I'm counting on it. He tipped my chin up with one finger, gray eyes gone soft as the bay at sunset. Marry me again, he said. Properly this time, no blackmail, no forged documents. Just us and whatever we actually want it to look like. We're already married, genius. I want a version where you said yes because you wanted to, he said, not because you were cornered into it. I want to redo the whole thing right, from the beginning, and get it correct this time. I studied him for a long moment, this absurd, storm-eyed man, and lowering his voice on my behalf, and looking at me like I'd rearranged the entire skyline just by existing in it. Fine, I said, but I want the shrimp cocktail at every course this time. And better pillows in the new place, and an actual honeymoon, not a press junket disguised as one with a nicer hotel. Done, Adrien said, and kissed me, slow, certain, tasting faintly of cold coffee and the particular relief of a man who'd finally stopped bracing for a fight that was never coming. I kissed him back and thought, somewhere in the pleasantly scrambled back half of my mind, that dying on a bagel at 2 a.m. might genuinely have been the single best career move I ever made in either lifetime. It's 68 degrees in here, Owen. It is a perfectly reasonable temperature for a grown man to survive in. You've turned our bedroom into a meat locker. I didn't look up from my book, currently something with actual dragons in it, exactly as promised, 2 years running, curled into the corner of our new penthouse's reading nook, overlooking a much nicer stretch of Biscayne Bay than the old house ever had. You survived 33 years of Miami summers before me. You'll survive this. Adrien dropped onto the couch beside me, dramatically pulling a throw blanket around his shoulders like I'd sentenced him to Siberia instead of 68 comfortable degrees. I married a man who almost got me publicly indicted for stealing hurricane relief funds and then, as a reward, froze me out of my own bedroom. You proposed to me in an atrium full of reporters an hour after I got Sebastian Klein fired on live television. We're both making choices here. Best choice I ever made, he said, and pressed a kiss to my temple that made my stomach do the same undignified flip it always did, 2 years and one very tasteful second wedding later, in front of exactly 40 guests and 0 tabloid photographers. Milo, promoted these days to actual chief of staff, though he still flinched slightly whenever I entered a room too fast, knocked on the doorframe. Sir, Mrs. Alvarez from the Homestead Housing Office is on line 2. She wanted to thank you both personally. The very last coastal rebuild family picked up their keys this morning. All of them, finally, actually home. Tell her I'll call back, I said, something warm and quiet settling behind my ribs at the news. I'm currently pinned under a very large, very cold man. I am not pinned, Adrien said, pinning me further into the cushions. I am cuddling, aggressively, as punishment. This is a hostage situation. You married into it. Twice, I reminded him, and he grinned. That rare, unguarded grin that used to be a state secret and was now just the ordinary weather of our mornings. And kissed me properly this time, slow and warm. Despite the AC, he'd never once actually let anyone touch the settings on again, no matter how much he complained about it on principle. Outside, the Miami skyline glittered gold in the late afternoon, 140 families finally, completely home across the bay because a dead paralegal from Denver had woken up in the wrong body, in the wrong marriage, in the wrong entire life, and had refused, out of pure spite and 11 years of professional habit, to let a bad spreadsheet slide. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was closer to a merger, messy, thoroughly audited, occasionally over-air-conditioned. But the ROI, all things considered, was looking very, very good. If you loved watching Owen dismantle a fraud ring with nothing but a red pen, 11 years of paralegal spite, and a truly heroic amount of shrimp cocktail, and Adrien falling completely, helplessly for his exhausted, thermostat-obsessed husband, smash that like button and share this one with a friend who needs a laugh today. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. Drop a comment and let me know. What's the one modern life skill you'd bring with you into a fantasy transmigration? Until next time, stay cozy, stay a little petty, and keep reading.